Welcome to the channel. Here, we dive deep into powerful books and break down their ideas in a calm, thoughtful way. In today's episode, we explore Behave, a deep dive into the biology of human behavior, uncovering what drives our actions from seconds before we act to the forces shaped over a lifetime. If you enjoy clear, thought-provoking breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for more.
Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision. It feels like engineering almost.
Right, it's very mechanical.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you fall off a ladder, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the bone, and the doctor just points at it and says, there's the problem.
It's highly comforting, honestly.
Yeah.
We really crave that kind of binary visibility in the world. Like, it's either broken or it's not broken.
But then you step into the world of human behavior, especially the really extreme, just baffling stuff we do to each other, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely useless.
Oh, completely.
We look at violence or, incredible acts of compassion, and we desperately want that simple x-ray. We want the one gene or the one childhood trauma or the one chemical imbalance we can point to and say, there it is, that's the jagged line, that's why they pulled the trigger, or that's why they donated a kidney.
And the reality is, that jagged line just doesn't exist. To truly understand behavior, we have to completely tear down that desire for a single root cause. Today, we are pulling apart the incredibly messy, deeply intertwined biology of human nature, our absolute best and our absolute worst.
Which is a huge undertaking.
It is. We're working from the framework laid out by neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky in his research, and the approach here is basically a chronological forensic investigation.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Well, we're going to deconstruct a behavior by working backward in time. So we start from the exact millisecond an action occurs in the brain, and then we zoom out to the minutes before, the hours before, and eventually the days before.
Wow. Okay. Which means we really have to start by confronting the ultimate behavioral paradox. Violence.
Right.
We treat violence like it's this universal evil, but the source material brings up this deeply personal, visceral childhood fantasy that Sapolsky has had for years. Which is wild because he's a guy who actively opposes the death penalty, advocates for strict gun control, and, generally avoids conflict.
Very peaceful academic.
Exactly. Yet he admits to this dark, recurring daydream about capturing and torturing Adolf Hitler. He imagines severing his spine, taking out his eyes, just doing terrible things just to make him feel pain.
It's a jarring admission, right?
Wait.
For anyone to make, let alone a peaceful neurobiologist.
Right.
But it perfectly isolates the core biological truth about us, which is that we don't actually hate violence. That is a cultural myth. We hate violence in the wrong context.
That distinction changes everything, doesn't it?
It really does. If you think about it, we absolutely adore violence when the context aligns with our values. I mean, we pay astronomical sums for ringside seats to watch two humans batter each other into unconsciousness.
So for sure, boxing, MMA.
Exactly. We buy highly realistic video games to simulate shooting people. We hand out medals for violence when it's framed as fighting for a just cause. Our brains do not abhor the physical, motoric act of violence. Our brains abhor the meaning behind the wrong kind of violence.
There are two stories from the research that beautifully capture how weirdly context-dependent we are. The first one is about his own wife.
Oh, the lollipop story.
Yes. So they're driving along, kids in the back seat, and some driver selfishly cuts them off and flips them the bird. Now, most people experience road rage in that moment. Maybe they yell, maybe they honk. She does something entirely different.
She gets creative.
Very. She aggressively tailgates the guy, corners him at a red light, gets out of the car, and marches up to his window.
Anticipating a physical altercation, most likely. The guy probably thought he was going to get punched.
But she doesn't hit him. She deploys what the text calls savage passive aggressiveness. She looks this guy dead in the eye and says, if you could do something that mean to another person, you probably really need this. And she throws a grape lollipop into his car.
It is a stunningly complex behavioral response.
A grape lollipop.
Right, because she is inflicting psychological damage disguised as sugary maternal pity. She wants to make him feel small and inadequate about whatever childhood trauma turned him into a miserable adult. It's a lollipop acting as a ballistic weapon.
It's brilliant. But then on the absolute opposite end of the spectrum of human behavior, you have this historical account from 1960s Indonesia.
This one is hard to hear.
It really is. During Suharto's military dictatorship, government-sponsored paramilitaries were purging hundreds of thousands of people, mass executions, burning down entire villages. And amid all this unspeakable horror, there are reports that some of these death squads would bring along traditional gamelan orchestras.
Like live musicians.
Yeah, musicians with flutes, singers, gongs, and they'd play live music during the massacres. When a veteran was later asked why on earth they would bring a beautiful orchestra to a mass murder, his answer was simply, well, to make it more beautiful.
It just makes your stomach turn. But analytically, both the lollipop and the bamboo flute playing over a massacre highlight the exact same underlying reality. Human behavior defies simple categorization. You cannot put these actions into a neat little box.
Okay, let's unpack this because that brings us to the first major conceptual hurdle we have to clear. The danger of bucket thinking, which I'm so guilty of this.
We all.
What do we actually mean by buckets?
So, as humans, our cognitive architecture really struggles with massive tangled webs of information. To manage the world, we naturally invent categorical buckets. We see a behavior and we say, oh, that's a psychological issue, or that's a genetic trait, or that's just environmental conditioning.
We want to file it away so it makes sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the research explicitly warns that a biological or psychological explanation is never a standalone cause. It is merely shorthand for an entire arc of influences. You cannot say a behavior is caused solely by a gene.
Because it's never just the gene.
Right. Because the moment you invoke a gene, you are implicitly invoking the evolutionary history that shaped that gene, the environment that triggered its expression, the hormones that it produces. It is a continuum.
So what happens when brilliant scientists actually get stuck in a single bucket? I mean, does it just lead to bad research papers?
It leads to historical catastrophes. Let's look at 3 profound warnings from the 20th century. First, you have John Watson, one of the founders of behaviorism in the 1920s. He fell pathologically into the environment is everything bucket. Watson famously proclaimed that if you gave him a dozen healthy infants in his own specified world to raise them in, he could take anyone at random and train them to become anything. A doctor, a lawyer, a merchant, or even a thief.
I mean, on the surface, that sounds wildly optimistic. It's the ultimate egalitarian dream, right? Anyone can be anything, regardless of where they come from.
That was exactly the societal appeal. After the rigid class structures and devastation of the early 20th century, people loved the idea that biology didn't matter. But Watson believed he could achieve this regardless of the child's talents, tendencies, or ancestors. He viewed the human infant as a completely blank slate.
Which ignores so much.
It ignores innate biology entirely, which led to decades of psychological practices that blamed mothers for absolutely everything, including complex neurodevelopmental conditions like schizophrenia or autism. They just assumed the environment of the mother's parenting was the sole cause.
That's tragic. So many mothers carrying guilt for things that were biological. But the second warning feels even more physically invasive. We're moving from the environmental bucket to the purely neurological bucket, right? Egas Moniz.
Moniz, he was a Portuguese neurologist who viewed the brain through a strictly mechanical lens. He believed that normal psychic life depends entirely on the functioning brain synapses, and therefore severe mental disorders were just synaptic derangements.
Like a broken circuit board.
Precisely. If the machine is broken, you cut the wires to fix it.
Which led him to develop the frontal leucotomy, the procedure that eventually became the infamous ice pick lobotomy.
And crazily enough, Moniz actually won a Nobel Prize in 1949 for this. Because the psychiatric establishment was so desperate to manage overflowing asylums, and because Moniz was so rigidly stuck in the bucket of viewing the nervous system as a crude circuit board, he pioneered a surgical technique that led to the assembly line destruction of tens of thousands of human brains.
Just going in through the eye socket and severing the frontal lobes.
Leaving them docile, empty shells.
Just a horrific outcome of reductionist thinking. And then you have Konrad Lorenz, which honestly might be the darkest of the 3.
It's certainly a disturbing pivot.
Lorenz was a celebrated animal behaviorist, also a Nobel laureate. If people know him, it's probably from those charming old photographs of him walking through the grass with a line of baby geese following him because they had imprinted on him.
He was a brilliant ethologist, but he became hopelessly mired in the genetic bucket. He believed that behavior was rigidly hardwired by genetics and that modern society was preventing natural selection from weeding out genetic degeneracy.
Wait, so the guy who loved baby geese became a eugenicist?
It's jarring, but yes. He took this false bucket of socially inferior human material and weaponized it. Lorenz actually joined the Nazi Party. He actively worked to scientifically rationalize their policies, conducting psychological screenings to determine who was sufficiently German and genetically pure enough to live, and who was degenerate and should be sent to the death camps.
Think about what that means for you listening right now. When we try to understand why someone cuts us off in traffic, or why a teenager acts out, or why a nation goes to war, we naturally reach for buckets. It's their upbringing. It's their testosterone.
It's never that simple.
Right. Relying on buckets is like trying to understand why a car crashed on a highway by only examining the bald tires. You look at the tire and say, lack of traction, case closed. But you completely ignored the driver who was sleep deprived, the failing brake line, and the patch of black ice on the road. You need the whole picture.
Exactly. So if we reject the buckets, how do we actually study behavior? We have to find the funnel, the final common pathway where the genetics, the childhood environment, the hormones, and the evolutionary baggage all converge. We have to start our timeline exactly 1 second before a behavior happens.
We have to look at the brain,
We have to look at the brain.
which requires a map. And the research introduces this older 1960s conceptual model called the triune brain by Paul MacLean. It essentially slices the brain into 3 evolutionary layers.
Anatomically, it's a gross oversimplification. I mean, thought and emotion don't sit in perfectly separated layers.
Right.
But conceptually, it's a brilliant entry point. Layer 1 is the ancient reptilian core at the base of the skull. It runs the automatic hardware breathing, shivering heart rate.
The stuff we don't think about.
Right. Then layer 2 is the limbic system, essentially the mammalian invention of emotion. And layer 3 is the neocortex, that wrinkled outer surface that handles advanced cognition, complex math, and impulse control.
And for this deep dive, we want to dive straight into layer 2, the emotional core, and specifically its most famous resident, the amygdala. Now, if you read pop science articles, the amygdala is constantly labeled as the aggression center, the part of the brain that makes us violent.
Yeah, that's a very common misconception. Because if you ask neuroscientists who dedicate their lives to studying the amygdala what its primary function is, aggression is actually a secondary byproduct. The amygdala is actually the brain's master command center for fear and anxiety.
Okay. So the part of our brain most responsible for generating violence is the exact same part that generates sheer terror?
Yes.
How does that practically manifest?
Well, look at the extreme neurological cases. Charles Whitman is a classic example. In 1966, Whitman was the Texas Tower sniper. He was a former Marine, an Eagle Scout, generally well regarded, and seemingly out of nowhere, he murders his wife and his mother, then barricades himself in a clock tower at the University of Texas and shoots dozens of strangers.
It's a famously horrifying event, but the chilling part is what he left behind.
His notes.
Right. He wrote notes before the murders explicitly stating that he was having overwhelming, irrational, violent impulses that he couldn't control or understand. He actually requested in his suicide note that an autopsy be performed on his brain to see if something was physically wrong with him.
And his intuition was terrifyingly accurate. The autopsy revealed a glioblastoma, a type of tumor pressing directly against his amygdala. Now, we must be careful not to fall into a bucket here.
Right, because it's never just one thing.
Exactly. Did the tumor in a vacuum cause his violence? No. He had a history of being abused by his father, so there was environmental trauma too. But the physical pressure of that tumor severely compromised the specific region of his brain responsible for threat detection. It essentially jammed the fear alarm in the on position,
Flooding his system.
flooding his system with perceived threats and anxiety, which bubbled over into horrific reactive violence.
It's basically a broken smoke detector that starts screaming when there's no smoke, and eventually it drives you to burn the house down. And the amygdala is incredibly sensitive to this. The research mentions Ulrich Meinhof, who was a journalist before she became a founder of the violently radical Red Army faction in 1960s West Germany. She had a supposedly benign brain tumor surgically removed, but the resulting scar tissue impinged on her amygdala.
And shortly after, she becomes a terrorist.
But if the amygdala is a threat detector, how does it know what to be afraid of? I mean, a tumor is a physical malfunction, but in a normal brain, how does it learn fear?
There are 2 pathways, innate fear and learned fear. Innate fear is hardwired by evolution. If you take a lab rat that was born in captivity, raised in a sterile plastic box, and has never seen a cat in its entire life, and you waft the scent of a cat into its cage, the rat will instantly freeze in absolute terror.
Because its ancestors knew cats equaled death.
Exactly. That innate ancestral fear is processed deep in the central core of the amygdala.
But we aren't just afraid of evolutionary predators. We learn to be afraid of specific neighborhoods or certain tones of voice or a ringing phone.
That is learned fear, and Joseph Ledoux mapped this brilliantly. He took a rat and played a specific audio tone, immediately followed by a mild electrical shock. Over time, the outer layer of the amygdala, the basolateral amygdala, physically rewires itself. The synapses strengthen. It learns that the tone predicts pain.
So the brain changes shape, essentially.
Yeah, and eventually the rat freezes in terror, just hearing the tone, without any shock at all. The outer layer learns the association and fires signals down into the central core to trigger the physical panic response.
So the amygdala isn't just reacting to the present, it is constantly scanning the environment, comparing it to past traumas, and learning to be suspicious of the future. And that suspicion bleeds directly into how we interact with other people.
Oh, absolutely. Look at the ultimatum game. It's a foundational experiment in behavioral economics. I'm given $10, I have to propose a split with you, I offer you $2, and I keep $8.
Okay.
You have the ultimate power. You can accept the $2, or you can reject my offer. If you reject it, the money vanishes, and we both get $0.
Now, a cold, purely mathematical analysis says I should accept the $2. $2 is objectively more than $0.
But human beings almost never do that. If an offer feels insulting or unfair, we overwhelmingly reject it. We will willingly take a financial loss just to punish the other person for being greedy.
Why? What is happening biologically in that moment that makes us throw away free money?
Your amygdala is firing. It injects a sense of social vigilance, anger, and distrust into your decision-making. We know this is true because researchers have run the ultimatum game with patients who have rare, localized damage, destroying their amygdala.
How do they play? Are they just ruthless?
The complete opposite. They are completely atypically generous. They accept terrible offers. They give away their own money. They are incredibly easy to scam. Researchers sometimes refer to it as pathological altruism.
Wow. Wait, really?
Yeah, because their amygdala is offline. They haven't retained the learned fear of being exploited. They are completely trusting. It suggests that the baseline human condition might actually be open trust. And it's the amygdala's exhausting job to learn when to be guarded.
Hold on. I need to understand something about violence here. If the amygdala is the center of fear, anxiety, and hypervigilance, and that panic is what drives people to lash out, what about psychopaths, serial killers? They aren't acting out of panic. They commit horrific violence with a resting heart rate.
That is a vital distinction, and I'm glad you brought it up. Psychopathic violence is fundamentally different from the reactive, hot-blooded violence we see in a bar fight or a road rage incident. Psychopathic violence is cold-blooded and instrumental. They are using violence as a calculated tool to obtain a goal.
So it's not fear-based.
Not at all. And neurologically, violent psychopaths do not have overactive amygdala. They actually have significantly smaller, underreactive amygdala.
So because they lack the basic physiological alarm bells of fear or empathy, they can just methodically execute a plan without their own brains screaming at them to stop.
Exactly. When the amygdala drives violence, it's nearly always rooted in feeling threatened. There is a fascinating experiment mentioned in the text using a modified game of Miss Pac-Man.
Like the arcade game.
Like the arcade game. Subjects are placed inside an fMRI brain scanner, which measures blood flow to different regions in real time. They are navigating a maze, and a virtual predator, the dot, is chasing them. The catch is, if the dot catches them, the subject receives a painful electrical shock in the real world.
So there are actual physical stakes. It's not just game over.
Right. As the predator gets closer and closer on the screen, the scanner watches the amygdala blood flow surge exponentially. The closer the threat, the harder the amygdala fires. It is the biological translation of sheer impending panic.
It is the body's smoke detector screaming, "Get out, attack, defend." But obviously, we don't act on every single panic impulse. I mean, if I spill coffee on my laptop, my amygdala might instantly scream, "Throw it out the window!" But I don't. I grab a towel instead.
What is the mechanism that steps in and shuts down the amygdala's panic?
That is the jurisdiction of the newest, most energy-intensive part of the human brain. We are moving from the accelerator to the braking system, section 3, the frontal cortex.
Frontal cortex. Sapolsky defines its job with perfect simplicity. It makes you do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. And structurally, it is fascinating because it is the very last region of the human brain to fully mature. It takes a long time. The process of myelination, where the brain essentially coats its neural wiring in insulation to make signals travel faster and more efficiently, doesn't finish in the frontal cortex until we are in our mid-20s.
Which explains nearly everything about teenagers. The impulse control center is literally under construction.
Completely.
It also contains these highly specialized, elongated cells called von Economo neurons, or spindle neurons, which seem uniquely adapted for rapid processing of complex social situations. But to truly grasp the monumental burden the frontal cortex carries, we have to look at what happens when it is suddenly deleted from the equation. We have to discuss Phineas Gage.
Yes, it remains the most legendary case study in the history of neuroscience. The year is 1848. Phineas Gage is a railroad construction foreman in Vermont. By all historical accounts, he is a highly competent, well-respected, even-keeled manager.
A good guy.
A very good guy. He is out in the field using a 13-pound iron tamping rod to pack explosive powder into a rock outcropping.
And the powder accidentally ignites.
The explosion drives this heavy iron rod upward like a missile. It enters right under his left cheekbone, passes behind his left eye, obliterates a massive section of his frontal cortex, and exits out the top of his skull, landing yards away.
Miraculously, he does not die. He is fully conscious. He's talking to the doctor mere hours later. But the Phineas Gage that survived was not the Phineas Gage that woke up that morning.
No, he was fundamentally changed. His physician wrote incredibly detailed notes about the aftermath. He observed that the equilibrium between Gage's intellectual faculties and his animal propensities had been completely destroyed. The new Gage was terribly profane, irritable, incapable of following through on plans, and highly inappropriate.
He lost his job. He ended up touring with a sideshow.
Right. Without the frontal cortex to act as the symphony conductor, reining in the impulses of the amygdala, he simply lost the biological capacity to do the harder thing.
We see this tragically play out today in neurodegenerative diseases. Conditions like frontotemporal dementia, or FTD, or Huntington's disease, they actively deteriorate the frontal cortex. As the tissue degrades, patients experience a profound loss of social inhibition. Loving grandparents might suddenly start shoplifting, developing compulsive gambling habits, or making sexually inappropriate comments to strangers.
The decider that filters our raw impulses is physically eroding.
But the frontal cortex isn't just a monolithic brake pedal, it is a highly sophisticated negotiating table. To understand how we make moral decisions, we have to look at two distinct, often warring factions within the frontal cortex itself.
Okay, let's break down the anatomy of a decision. On one side, you have the DLPFC, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Think of this as the cold, rational, utilitarian calculator. It doesn't feel, it just crunches the numbers. It is pure cognitive logic.
And across the table,
You have the VMPFC, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. This is the emotional interface. It sits right above the limbic system, acting as a translator between the cold logic of the cortex and the raw emotion of the amygdala. It generates your gut feelings.
the ultimate philosophical thought experiment perfectly illustrates how these two factions fight it out. The runaway trolley problem. Imagine you're standing next to a train track. A runaway trolley is hurtling down the rails toward 5 oblivious workers tied to the track. You are standing next to a lever. If you pull the lever, the trolley will divert onto a sidetrack. However, there is one person tied to the sidetrack who will be killed. Do you pull the lever?
When surveyed, the vast majority of people say yes, they would pull the lever. And when you run this scenario while monitoring their brain activity, the DLPSC, the cold calculator, lights up. The math is simple. Saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 life yields a net positive of 4 lives. It's a utilitarian calculation.
But then you change the parameters. Same runaway trolley, same 5 people tied to the track. But this time, there is no sidetrack. Instead, you are standing on a footbridge directly above the tracks, right next to a very large stranger. The only physical way to stop the trolley and save the 5 people is to push this large stranger off the bridge onto the tracks below. His body mass will stop the trolley. He will die, but the 5 will live. Do you push him?
Mathematically, the outcome is identical to the lever scenario. You are sacrificing 1 life to save 5, but behavioral responses plummet. Most people recoil and say absolutely not. They could never physically push the man.
Right, because it feels different.
It feels very different. And when we look at the brain scanner during this scenario, the cold DLPFC is heavily suppressed. Instead, the emotional VMPFC and the amygdala are firing wildly.
Why the difference? The math is the same.
Because pulling a mechanical lever is abstract. Pushing a human being with your own hands is intimate and visceral. The thought of physically causing harm triggers a massive emotional biological aversion from the VMPFC that completely overrides the cold calculus of the DLPFC.
But wait, if the emotional VMPFC is the only thing preventing us from making the objectively mathematically correct choice to save 5 lives, Isn't that a biological flaw? Why wouldn't evolution just strip out the emotional interference and leave us with pure cold logic? Shouldn't we strive to be purely rational beings like Spock?
It sounds ideal in theory, but neuroscientist Antonio Damasio proved why pure logic is a disaster for human survival. Damasio studied patients who had very specific lesions that destroyed their emotional VMPFC, leaving their rational DLPSC completely intact.
So they were basically human Vulcans.
Precisely. They tested perfectly normal on IQ tests, memory tests, logic puzzles, but in the real world, their lives fell apart. They made catastrophic decisions. They would bankrupt themselves on terrible investments or alienate their entire families.
Why? If they were perfectly logical, why couldn't they navigate life?
Because they lacked what Damasio termed somatic markers, somatic means of the body. When you or I contemplate making a risky or potentially hurtful decision, we don't just think about it, we physically feel it.
Yeah.
Our VMPFC runs a lightning-fast simulation and triggers the vagus nerve. Your stomach drops, your heart rate shifts, you feel a flutter of anxiety.
Your body is giving you negative feedback before you even make the choice.
Yes, it's the physical sting of a bad idea. Damasio's patients lacked this physical feedback loop. Without the bodily sensation of anxiety or guilt, they had no compass. They could list the pros and cons of an investment for hours, but they couldn't feel which one was dangerous.
And socially, they must have been a mess.
Totally detached. They are the person who will walk up to a friend and say, "You look incredibly old and haggard today." And when the friend starts crying, the patient is genuinely confused. They were just stating a logical visual fact. They lack the emotional somatic marker that says, "Don't say that, it will cause social pain." We absolutely need emotion to govern logic.
That is profound. But constantly running this system, the DLPFC doing the math, the VMPFC simulating the emotional pain, the frontal cortex as a whole shouting down the amygdala's panic, it has to be physically exhausting.
It is incredibly taxing on the body. This is the concept of cognitive load. The frontal cortex is a massive consumer of metabolic energy, specifically blood glucose. Every time you bite your tongue instead of yelling at a coworker, or force yourself to focus on a spreadsheet instead of checking your phone, your frontal cortex is burning fuel to maintain that inhibition.
Which implies that willpower is not just a character trait, it is a finite biological resource.
Exactly. When you are tired, stressed, or hungry, your frontal cortex literally runs low on glucose. The braking system starts to fail. Studies consistently show that when people are experiencing high cognitive load or low blood sugar, they become significantly less charitable, more prone to lying, and quicker to aggression.
This is the biological reality behind the phenomenon of judges granting fewer paroles right before lunch, or why you invariably end up fighting with your partner when you're both exhausted after a long trip. The decider is out of gas.
But this raises a crucial mechanical question. If the frontal cortex is constantly burning fuel to stop us from doing fun, impulsive, or easy things, it must be getting massive motivation from somewhere to keep doing the hard work.
What is the engine that drives the brakes? That brings us to section 4, the dopamine system. Now, here's where it gets really interesting because the research completely upends how most of us understand this chemical. Pop culture treats dopamine as the ultimate reward chemical. You eat a slice of cake, you get dopamine. You have an orgasm, you get dopamine. It's the pleasure molecule.
But neurobiologists see it entirely differently. Dopamine is not about the reward itself. It is about the anticipation of the reward.
Explain how we know that, because it's a massive paradigm shift.
It goes back to a beautifully elegant experiment with monkeys. You place a monkey in a room, a light comes on. The monkey has been trained to know that if it presses a lever 10 times after the light comes on, a small chute will open, and it gets a highly desirable reward, a raisin. Meanwhile, researchers are constantly measuring the dopamine firing from the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, deep in the monkey's brain.
Logic says the dopamine should spike when the monkey finally eats the delicious raisin.
But it doesn't. Once the monkey understands the rules, the dopamine levels spike massively the exact millisecond the light comes on, long before the lever is pressed, long before the raisin is tasted.
So the chemical rush happens when the opportunity is presented?
Exactly. Dopamine is the chemical fuel of anticipation. If the monkey did not get that initial surge of dopamine when the light came on, it would literally not have the biological motivation to walk over and do the physical work of pressing the lever 10 times. Dopamine isn't the happiness of the reward. It is the happiness of the pursuit.
But then the researchers tweak the rules of the game, and this is where it gets incredibly manipulative. They introduce intermittent reinforcement.
This is the most powerful psychological hook in existence. The setup is the same. Light comes on, monkey presses the lever 10 times. But now, The chute only opens and delivers the raisin 50% of the time. It is a coin toss. Sometimes you get the raisin, sometimes you get nothing. What do you think happens to the monkey's dopamine levels when the light comes on now?
I mean, you'd think it would drop because the reward is less certain, but it explodes.
It goes through the roof. The dopamine release is astronomically higher than when the reward was guaranteed 100% of the time.
Why? Why does the brain reward uncertainty?
Because uncertainty demands more attention. When a reward is guaranteed, the brain habituates. It says, okay, I know this game, it's safe, I don't need to devote much energy to it. But when there is a 50-50 chance, the tension of maybe drives the dopaminergic pathways into overdrive to keep you locked onto the task.
This is literally the exact biological blueprint of Las Vegas. Think about a slot machine. The flashing lights are the cue. You pull the lever, but you only win occasionally. And when you get a near miss, 2 cherries line up, but the third one just barely misses. Your brain doesn't register that as a loss. It registers it as a massive dopaminergic almost, which compels you to pull the lever again. It is weaponized dopamine.
It governs modern life.
Think about ordering something online. You click buy on a pair of shoes. Over the next 3 days, you compulsively check the tracking number. It left the facility, it's out for delivery. Every time you check, you get a hit of dopamine. But when the cardboard box actually arrives on your porch and you open it, there's often this slight letdown. The shoes are just shoes. The massive high was the 3 days of anticipation.
But the truly staggering thing is how humans scale this biology. A monkey can delay gratification and ride a dopamine wave for a few seconds to get a raisin. Humans have evolved the capacity to delay gratification for decades.
We spend 4 years doing grueling late-night studying to get a college degree. We put 10% of our paycheck into an index fund for 40 years for a retirement we haven't even experienced yet.
We push it even further into the abstract. Depending on your cultural or religious framework, humans can use the dopaminergic power of anticipation to motivate themselves to do incredible, exhausting work for a reward they believe will only come after they are dead. People will take vows of poverty, endure horrific persecution, or even sacrifice their lives in battle, entirely fueled by the brain's ability to anticipate a promised afterlife. No other organism on the planet can stretch dopamine across eternity like that.
It is breathtakingly unique to our species. So let's take a breath and map where we are. We have the amygdala deep inside, constantly scanning for threats and sounding the alarm. We have the frontal cortex sitting on top, burning energy to calculate outcomes and pump the brakes. And we have dopamine pathways injecting the motivation needed to keep the whole system running. But these internal circuits are not sealed off in a vacuum. They are constantly being poked, prodded, and manipulated by invisible forces in the outside world, mere seconds before we make a decision.
Which pulls us into section 5, seconds to minutes before. The realm of subliminal sensory triggers. We like to believe that we are sovereign, conscious agents making rational choices, but our brains are absorbing and reacting to environmental cues so rapidly that our conscious mind doesn't even know it's happening.
And to explore how intense this is, we have to look at the data surrounding race and visual processing. I want to be incredibly clear here to you listening. We are looking strictly at the neurobiology detailed in the research. We are examining how the physiological wiring of the human brain processes visual information impartially, and the data is deeply unsettling.
It relies on a specific piece of anatomy. Visual information hits your retina, travels via the optic nerve, and hits a relay station called the thalamus. From the thalamus, the primary route goes to the visual cortex at the back of your brain, which takes its time to consciously process and identify exactly what you're seeing.
Yeah.
But there's a secondary, much faster shortcut. A bundle of neurons goes straight from the thalamus directly to the amygdala.
Meaning the fear center gets a blurry, low-resolution snapshot of the world before you even consciously know what you are looking at.
Yes. And because of our evolutionary history of tribalism, the amygdala is exquisitely attuned to anything that looks unfamiliar or outgroup. If you place a subject in an fMRI scanner and flash a picture of a face of someone from a different race for just 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second, so fast it doesn't even register in their conscious awareness, the amygdala violently activates.
The brain's threat detector spikes before the visual cortex can even say, hey, that's just a photograph of a person.
And we can track how this split-second biology translates into real-world tragedy. The research references the 1999 killing of Amadou Diallo, an unarmed West African immigrant in New York. He reached into his pocket for his wallet, and 4 police officers fired 41 shots at him, convinced he was drawing a gun.
How does the brain make such a catastrophic miscalculation in a fraction of a second?
Researchers simulate these split-second threat scenarios while measuring the electrical activity on the surface of the scalp, using something called event-related potentials, or ERPs. They're essentially tracking the electrical ripples as different parts of the brain fire. When you see a face or an object, within about 200 milliseconds, there is a measurable electrical spike called the P200. This correlates with the amygdala detecting a potential threat.
So the P200 is the alarm bell.
Exactly. But mere milliseconds later, a second electrical wave follows called the N200. This wave originates from the frontal cortex. It's the braking system. It is the cortex engaging, inhibiting the impulse to shoot and saying, hold on, let the visual cortex finish rendering the image. Is that a gun or is it a cell phone?
So you have the P200 screaming fire and the N200 screaming wait.
And in simulations, implicit biases drastically alter the ratio between these two waves. If a subject has a deeply conditioned societal bias, the P200 threat wave is massive when viewing an outgroup member, and the N200 braking wave is weak and sluggish. The sheer force of the amygdala's electrical panic overwhelms the frontal cortex's brakes, and the subject pulls the trigger in the simulation before they consciously realize the object was just a wallet.
It shows how terrifyingly fast biology overrides logic. But the environment isn't just manipulating us with visual face processing. Even the words we hear seconds before a choice can completely hijack our frontal cortex.
Language is a profound primer. Researchers ran an experiment using a classic economics game where players have to decide whether to cooperate for a mutual payout or backstab the other person to steal the whole pot. They gave the exact same game with the exact same rules to two different groups, but they changed the title on the instruction sheet. For Group A, they called it the Wall Street game. For Group B, they called it the Community game.
And that single phrase changed their neurobiology.
Dramatically. The people playing the Wall Street game played ruthlessly. They lied, they backstabbed, they acted selfishly. The people playing the Community game suddenly became highly cooperative and trusting. The subliminal association of the words primed their brains to adopt entirely different social survival strategies.
You see this in medicine all the time, right? If a doctor looks at a patient and says, this surgery has a 95% survival rate, the patient almost always consents. If the doctor says, this surgery has a 5% death rate, patients are overwhelmingly more likely to refuse the operation. The mathematical reality is absolutely identical, but the word death acts as a tripwire for the amygdala, generating anxiety that the frontal cortex can't easily override.
And it goes beyond language. Let's talk about olfaction. Smell.
Oh, this experiment blew my mind.
Researchers collect the sweat of a person who has just gone on a vigorous jog on a treadmill. They have test subjects sniff this exercise sweat while looking at pictures of faces with neutral or ambiguous expressions. Nothing much happens. But then they collect the sweat of a first-time skydiver, someone who is plummeting out of an airplane in a state of sheer biological terror.
The sweat of genuine panic.
They have new subjects sniff the fear sweat. Consciously, the subjects can't tell the difference between the two scents. They both just smell like body odor. But subconsciously, the pheromones of terror enter the olfactory bulb, which wires directly into the amygdala. Suddenly, these subjects start interpreting those neutral, ambiguous faces as looking angry, threatening, or fearful.
That's incredible.
The subliminal smell of fear is literally contagious. It primes your brain to see the world as a more dangerous place.
And the visual environment does the exact same thing to our morals. There is a classic study where researchers put an honor system jar next to the coffee machine in an office break room. You pour a coffee, you're supposed to drop $1 in the jar. Week 1, they put a picture of flowers on the wall above the jar. People drop in a few bucks. Week 2, they replace the flowers with a picture of 2 eyes staring straight ahead.
And the contributions triple.
A photocopy of eyes. It isn't a real person. But the visual cue of being watched subliminally activates the frontal cortex's social compliance protocols. We suddenly act more morally because we feel observed. This scales up to the famous broken window theory experiment. Researchers place a large visible sign on a fence that says no bicycles allowed. Then they deliberately chain a few bicycles to the fence, directly violating the sign.
They are artificially creating an environment of disorder.
Right, and then they observe the people walking by this fence. When pedestrians see that a rule is already being visibly broken, they become twice as likely to litter in that area or even steal money from an envelope left nearby. The visual cue of mild lawlessness lowers the threshold in their brain for committing their own antisocial behavior.
The environment acts as an invisible hand, constantly pushing our behavioral levers.
But wait, I have to stop here because this paints a very deterministic picture. If a photograph of eyes forces me to be honest, and a dirty alleyway forces me to litter, and the smell of someone's sweat makes me paranoid, do I have any actual agency? Am I just a helpless biological robot reacting to trash on the street?
It is the most important question you can ask, and the answer is no. You are not a helpless robot. But your agency is expensive.
What does that mean, expensive?
The frontal cortex can override every single one of these subliminal triggers. If you show someone an outgroup face, the amygdala fires. But if they have the time and the conscious intention, their frontal cortex can step in, suppress the bias, and engage with that person rationally. You can consciously force yourself to throw your trash in a bin, even if the alley is covered in garbage.
So the triggers aren't destiny.
They aren't destiny, but they represent the path of least resistance. Overriding them requires immense metabolic effort. It takes cognitive load. We are not robots, but we are profoundly, heavily context-dependent creatures, navigating a world that is constantly whispering instructions to our unconscious minds.
Okay, so the environment seconds ago primed my brain. But that raises another question. Why does the exact same trigger affect me differently on different days? Let's say I get a slightly passive-aggressive email from a coworker. On a Tuesday, my frontal cortex brushes it off. Whatever, they're just stressed. But on a Thursday, I read the exact same email, my amygdala explodes, and I draft a furious, career-ending reply. What shifted my brain's baseline sensitivity?
To understand that, we have to keep moving backward. We have to look at what was swimming in your bloodstream hours or even days before the event. We are stepping into the endocrine system, the world of hormones. And the research here is dedicated to completely dismantling the massive cultural myths surrounding two incredibly powerful molecules, testosterone and oxytocin.
Let's tackle testosterone first. It is the ultimate cultural scapegoat. The prevailing myth is that testosterone causes aggression. You pump a guy full of steroids, he turns into the Hulk, he punches a hole in the drywall. It is seen as the aggression hormone. But Sapolsky's work dismantles this entirely.
It does. In endocrinology, if you want to prove that a hormone definitively causes a behavior, you use a subtraction and replacement test. If testosterone is the sole cause of male aggression, then if you castrate a male subject, whether it's a primate or a human, removing the testosterone source, the aggression should drop to absolute zero.
But it doesn't drop to zero.
It drops significantly, yes, but it does not disappear. And crucially, if the individual had a long established history of aggressive behavior before castration, the aggression barely drops at all. Social learning and ingrained neural habits can maintain violent behavior even in the complete absence of the hormone.
So if testosterone doesn't spontaneously create aggression out of thin air, what is it actually doing in the brain?
The research introduces the challenge hypothesis, which is the unifying framework for understanding this hormone. Testosterone levels do not predict who will start a bar fight on a random evening. Instead, testosterone rises specifically when an individual is facing a challenge to their status. It does not create aggression. It merely lowers the threshold for the amygdala to fire if aggression is the required tool to maintain dominance. It's an amplifier.
It's a volume dial, not an on-off switch. And to prove how context-dependent this volume dial is, researchers ran the ultimatum game again. Remember, the game where you propose a split of money, and if the other person rejects it out of spite, you both get nothing.
Right. So researchers take a group of subjects and inject them with a massive dose of testosterone. Based on the cultural myth, you would expect these people to become wildly aggressive, greedy jerks who demand 90% of the money and threaten the other players.
Well, what actually happened?
The subjects who received the testosterone actually made more generous offers to the other players than the placebo group.
That feels completely backward. Why would the macho hormone make you generous?
Because you have to look at the specific context of the ultimatum game. In this game, if you make a greedy, lousy offer, the other person rejects it. You lose the money, and more importantly, you look foolish, you lose status. In the hyper-specific micro-society of the ultimatum game, fairness and generosity are the most effective strategies for maintaining your reputation and status.
This is such a critical paradigm shift. Testosterone just makes you fiercely motivated to protect your status. If society rewards being a violent bully to get status, testosterone will make you a highly effective bully. But if you put someone in a society that rewards philanthropy, cooperation, and being nice, testosterone will chemically drive them to be the nicest person in the room. The hormone doesn't care about violence, it only cares about social survival.
It is the ultimate amplifier of whatever social rules currently govern your environment. Now let's look at the other side of the hormonal coin. Oxytocin.
The internet's favorite molecule. Oxytocin is relentlessly marketed as the cuddle hormone, the trust molecule. There are TED Talks suggesting that if we could just aerosolize oxytocin and spray it into the United Nations ventilation system, we would achieve world peace.
And you can see how the myth originated, because its evolutionary roots are beautiful. Oxytocin evolved in female mammals to prepare the body for birth-stimulating uterine contractions and triggering milk letdown for nursing. From that basic biological plumbing, it evolved in the brain to promote maternal behavior and pair bonding.
The classic example is prairie voles. These little rodents are famous because they are strictly monogamous. They mate for life, like a Disney movie. And their brains are absolutely saturated with receptors for oxytocin and its closely related sibling hormone, vasopressin. But my favorite example of this is the cross-species bond. When a dog and a human look into each other's eyes, both the human and the dog experience a measurable mutual spike in oxytocin in their bloodstreams. It is literally the chemical bridge that allowed us to domesticate wolves.
So far, it sounds exactly like the cuddle hormone. But neurobiology is rarely that simple. Oxytocin isn't actually about universal love. Its core function is to promote social competence and in-group bias. And this is where the dark side emerges. Because if oxytocin chemically compels you to be fiercely loyal, trusting, and loving toward your pair bond and your offspring, it simultaneously makes you fiercely defensive and aggressive against anyone who might threaten them.
It creates an us, which inherently requires them.
Exactly. The Dutch psychologist Karsten de Drew ran a series of breathtaking studies to prove this. He placed subjects in a complex economic game where they belonged to a specific team, and they had the option to either cooperate with a rival team or preemptively backstab them to protect their own resources.
And he gave the men a nasal spray of synthetic oxytocin.
Yes, the myth says the oxytocin should make them love the rival team and cooperate, but reality showed the opposite. The oxytocin made them highly cooperative and self-sacrificing for their own teammates, but it made them drastically more likely to preemptively backstab the outgroup members. It heightened their suspicion and hostility toward strangers.
And it gets so much darker when you look at moral decision-making. De Drew had Dutch subjects perform the runaway trolley problem. You have to push one person onto the tracks to save 5 people. But he tweaked the experiment by giving the sacrificial person a name. Sometimes the person had a stereotypically native Dutch name like Dirk or Peter. Sometimes the person had a stereotypically Arab name like Ahmed or a German name like Helmut.
And he administered the oxytocin.
The results are terrifying. When given the oxytocin, the Dutch subjects were far less likely to push Dirk or Peter in front of the train. The hormone made them fiercely protective of their in-group, but they had absolutely no problem throwing Ahmed or Helmut to their deaths to save 5 unnamed people.
The oxytocin chemically amplified their ethnocentrism. It didn't make them universally loving, it made them xenophobic. It heightened the brain's dividing line between who is an us that deserves protection and who is a them that is expendable.
Calling oxytocin the cuddle hormone completely ignores that it is the very chemical responsible for some of our worst tribalistic instincts. It's the US versus them molecule. Now, before we pull all of this together, we have to briefly address one more massive biological myth, specifically regarding female aggression. Because there is a historical assumption that males are the biologically aggressive sex, while females are biologically passive and affiliative.
Which is a complete misunderstanding of evolutionary biology. Female aggression is highly potent. It's just often strategically different. It typically revolves around protecting resources, defending offspring, or fighting for reproductive access. And nature is full of exceptions that break our gender expectations. The research highlights the spotted hyena as a phenomenal example.
I find the spotted hyena completely fascinating. If you look at their packs, the females are physically larger, vastly more muscular, and completely violently dominant over the males. The lowest ranking female in a hyena clan still outranks the highest ranking male.
And the biology driving this is wild. In spotted hyenas, the female fetuses are bathed in incredibly high levels of androgens, male hormones, while still in the womb. This fundamentally alters their development. They develop pseudopenises, enlarged clitorises that can become erect, and fake scrotums.
They literally grow physical male anatomical features.
Yes, and hormonally, they are wired to be relentlessly aggressive. When a kill is made, the females will violently attack and boot the males away from the carcass to ensure that they and their pups eat first. It perfectly illustrates that biology is not locked into our cultural gender norms. Evolution will use hormones like testosterone across any gender to accomplish whatever survival strategy is necessary.
And when talking about female biology and aggression, Sapolsky takes a very careful, vital look at PMS, or premenstrual syndrome. For decades in the 20th century, the medical establishment and even the legal system tried to tightly link the biological hormone fluctuations of the menstrual cycle to severe, widespread criminal aggression. There were actually high-profile murder trials in the UK and US where the defense successfully argued for reduced sentences by claiming the defendant was biologically out of control due to PMS.
And we have to separate the biological reality from the cultural construct here. Are the biological shifts real? Absolutely. The drop in progesterone and fluctuations in estrogen can measurably affect neurotransmitter function, leading to increased irritability or depressive symptoms. We see this across primate species. Even female baboons show documented behavioral shifts before menstruation.
The biology is real.
But the historical medicalization of it, the attempt to link these normal hormonal fluctuations to severe, uncontrollable violent criminality, was vastly overstated. The data does not support PMS as a driver of systemic violent behavior. The exaggerated focus on it was often a cultural tool used to pathologize female biology and paint women as emotionally unstable, rather than a factual neurobiological explanation for extreme violence.
It was another false bucket that society tried to force biology into. Which brings us to the end of our timeline. Think about the journey we've just taken. We started by looking at the hormones swimming in our bloodstream from days ago, dictating how fiercely we protect our status or our tribe. We looked at the subliminal smells and visual cues hitting our senses minutes ago, invisibly steering our morals. And we looked at the massive energy-burning war between the amygdala's panic and the frontal cortex's logic a millisecond before we act.
We have completely dismantled the bucket theory.
That's the core takeaway here. You cannot point to an X-ray. You cannot say a behavior is just genetics or just society. A single human action, whether it is pulling a trigger in a crowded space, or throwing a grape lollipop at a terrible driver, or choosing to cooperate in a game, is the result of a massive, staggering biological pileup. It depends on whether your frontal cortex had enough blood glucose to hit the brakes. It depends on whether a subtle word primed your amygdala to see a threat. It depends on whether testosterone was amplifying your need for status, or if oxytocin was blinding you to the humanity of an outsider. It is all hopelessly, beautifully connected.
And synthesizing all of that leads to a rather profound, almost uncomfortable final thought for you to carry with you. We have spent this entire time tracing the causality backward, step by step, identifying the invisible levers that push and pull our actions. But if every single choice you make, the choice to help a stranger in the street, or the choice to lash out in anger at someone you love, is actually the culmination of a millisecond's electrical wave in your brain, an invisible pheromone in the air, and the exact ratio of hormones circulating in your blood from hours ago, where exactly does your free will reside?
That is a staggering question.
If you are fundamentally the sum of biological and environmental inputs that you often can't even see, let alone control, how should that change the way we judge the absolute best and the absolute worst behaviors in each other?
It forces a total reevaluation of empathy and justice. Suddenly, searching for that clean binary X-ray of human behavior doesn't just feel impossible, it feels inadequate. The machine really is broken. But honestly, as we wade through these incredibly messy, deeply intertwined diagnostic waters together, realizing just how wildly complex the biology of our behavior truly is, it is awe-inspiring. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, be kind to your frontal cortex, and keep questioning the why behind what we do. Catch you next time.